The champagne glasses clinked in harmony as the chandelier's golden glow cast a dazzling sheen over the sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns. Amid the vibrant cacophony of laughter and toasts, my gaze locked on her. She stood poised near the head of the grand table, her crimson dress sculpting her figure like a provocative masterpiece. Her laughter rang out effortlessly as she tilted her head toward him, the CEO. His hand rested on her lower back, a gesture too intimate for professional decorum, and the way he leaned in to whisper, his words meant only for her, lit a fire in my chest that I couldn't extinguish. Then it happened. As the clock struck midnight, the room erupted into jubilant cheers, balloons cascading from the ceiling as a collective Happy New Year reverberated. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with excitement, and leaned in. Her lips brushed his in a fleeting yet unmistakable kiss. Time slowed, every second stretching painfully as the betrayal unfolded before me. My knuckles turned white around the stem of my champagne flute as the sharp sting of betrayal seared through me. But my silence wasn't from shock, it was intentional. Every instinct in me screamed to act, but I knew better. This was not the time for an impulsive outburst. The storm within me would not be unleashed in a moment of anger. It would be calculated, precise, and devastating. I took a measured breath, scanning the room. No one else seemed to notice the tectonic shift unraveling in my life. They were too absorbed in their own celebrations, oblivious to the fragments of my reality crumbling around me. For weeks I had seen the signs, lingering glances, late-night meetings, and her newfound enthusiasm for events she once dismissed. Each moment had been a crack in the foundation of our life together, a life meticulously built on trust and shared dreams. Tonight, that foundation collapsed completely. I slipped out onto the balcony, the winter air biting against my skin as I sought clarity. Below, the city glimmered in stark contrast to the shadows clouding my thoughts. I leaned against the cold steel railing, letting its chill ground me. Memories of the years we had shared, the promises exchanged, and the trust we had nurtured replayed in my mind. The betrayal that now lay at my feet was crushing, but I wasn't broken, not yet. The plan forming in my mind was ruthless but necessary. Betrayal demanded justice, and justice would be served not here, not now, but in time. The balcony door creaked behind me. A waiter stepped out, balancing a tray of champagne. I waved him off without a word, my focus already returning to the scene inside. Through the glass I saw her laughing with him again, her hand brushing his arm lightly, intimately. My grip on the railing tightened as the waiter's parting words, "Enjoy your evening," dripped with cruel irony. I turned back to the party, masking my anguish with a calm facade as I rejoined the crowd. The storm brewing inside me wasn't over, it was only beginning. Neither she nor her lover could foresee what awaited them. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the start of theirs. The life we had built had seemed flawless, a suburban home on a quiet cul-de-sac, pristine lawns trimmed weekly, walls adorned with family portraits showcasing holidays, milestones, and memories of love and stability. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple. I had worked tirelessly, climbing the corporate ladder to ensure we had more than comfort. I wanted a legacy. Vanessa, my wife, had been my anchor, or so I thought. A sharp ambitious marketing executive, she had balanced her career with the warmth and joy she brought into our home. I admired her, trusted her completely, never questioning her long hours or frequent business trips as she pursued her dreams. But cracks in the perfection began to show. Missed dinners became routine, her once cherished evenings at home replaced by late meetings or texts dismissing her absence. "It's work," she'd say, or "I'll grab a bite at the office." Her wardrobe changed to designer dresses, handbags worth a fortune, shoes that sparkled like trophies. She laughed off my questions, attributing it to promotions or harmless indulgences. Even her demeanor shifted, she grew guarded, her phone always within reach. Our once easy laughter turned to clipped conversations, her focus constantly elsewhere. I dismissed it as stress, until the night my suspicion solidified. 2 weeks before the New Year's gala, her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. The screen lit up with a message, "Don't forget our meeting tomorrow." My chest tightened. I didn't need to ask who it was from. Her boss, Charles Everly, was the obvious sender. I had met him once, a charismatic man with charm and power, the kind of person who left an impression. That night, suspicion began to consume me, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The signs had always been there, but I had refused to see them. Tonight, the truth became undeniable. The storm inside me, fueled by betrayal and anger, wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning of a meticulously crafted plan. My story wasn't over, it was about to take a calculated turn. And when the time came, the justice I delivered would be absolute. There was something about Charles Everly that always unsettled me. He exuded confidence, his charm and presence undeniable, but the way his gaze lingered on Vanessa just a beat too long set me on edge. His laughter seemed to echo louder whenever she spoke, a subtle claim to her attention that didn't sit right with me. Still, I trusted her. I trusted us. That trust, once unwavering, now felt misplaced, like an old suit that no longer fit. I didn't confront her about the message I'd seen that night. Instead, I began to watch, to observe the patterns that I had previously ignored. The way her face lit up when her phone chimed, the way her words carried a rehearsed nonchalance. Everything became a clue. Each moment another piece of the puzzle that was slowly coming into focus. By the time the New Year's gala arrived, I was no longer the man I had been a month ago. My admiration for Vanessa had twisted into a painful blend of sorrow and anger, tempered by a clarity that came from knowing what I had to do. The signs I had ignored, the missed dinners, the guarded conversations, the inexplicable distance played on a loop in my mind. I had convinced myself her growing aloofness was just a phase, that her secrets were harmless. But the foundation of the life we had built together was splintering beneath my feet. Even as my world crumbled, I refused to let it consume me. Betrayal doesn't break a man, it reveals him. And in that glittering ballroom, as I watched her lips meet his, I realized I was no longer the man who would sit idly by, hoping for things to change. I was the man who would bring the storm. A few days earlier, I had found a receipt sitting on the counter, a small, unassuming slip of paper that carried more weight than any argument. It bore the logo of a luxury boutique downtown, a store we had never shopped at together. The purchase, a crimson gown, bought 2 days prior for an extravagant amount. I stared at the receipt, my mind scrambling to come up with excuses for her. Perhaps it was a surprise for me. No, the tags were still on the dress hanging in her closet, except that same dress had graced her figure at the gala last night. The explanation was painfully clear, but accepting it was like swallowing shards of glass. That evening I waited. Confrontation wasn't my goal, not yet. She arrived home late, a faint trace of unfamiliar perfume trailing behind her. It wasn't hers. It wasn't mine either. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, her gesture more mechanical than affectionate, before retreating upstairs. Moments later, her phone rang. I didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. Her voice, muffled behind the bathroom door, carried a mix of urgency and intimacy. "I'll handle it tomorrow." "Yes, I know." "No, he doesn't suspect anything." The singular male pronoun he sparked a smoldering fire in my chest. I stood outside the door, fists clenched, her words pressing heavily on me. When she emerged minutes later, she wore a practiced smile, the kind that masked more than it revealed. "Who was that?" I asked lightly. "Work emergency," she replied without missing a beat, brushing past me into the bedroom. I didn't follow her. Instead, I sank into the living room armchair, the evidence mounting in my mind like a case file. Every piece painted a clear picture of what I had tried so hard to deny. I'd met Charles Everly once, at a company gala. He was magnetic, as powerful men often are, with a perfectly tailored suit and a handshake that lingered just long enough to assert dominance. His presence filled the room, his voice commanding every conversation. I remembered how Vanessa introduced him. "This is Charles, my boss," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I couldn't place then, but recognized now: admiration, deference, attraction. His smile had been polite but calculating, his words polished yet unsettling. "Vanessa's been instrumental to our success this year," he said, praising her in a tone that sounded professional but felt proprietary. His gaze lingered on her in a way that, in hindsight, spoke volumes. I'd met Charles Everly once, at a company gala. He was magnetic, as powerful men often are, with a perfectly tailored suit and a handshake that lingered just long enough to assert dominance. His presence filled the room, his voice commanding every conversation. I remembered how Vanessa introduced him. "This is Charles, my boss," she said, her voice carrying an undertone I couldn't place then, but recognized now: admiration, deference, attraction. His smile had been polite but calculating, his words polished yet unsettling. "Vanessa's been instrumental to our success this year," he said, praising her in a tone that sounded professional but felt proprietary. His gaze lingered on her in a way that, in hindsight, spoke volumes. The following morning, Vanessa left early for another meeting. Her crimson dress was conspicuously absent from the closet. I spent the day replaying every moment I'd overlooked: the hushed phone calls, the unexplained absences, the receipt she hadn't even bothered to hide. That evening, I found myself scrolling through Charles Everly's public profile. Pictures of him at events, handshakes with political figures, staged family portraits. He looked every bit the polished, untouchable success story. But if you looked closely, the cracks were there. Discreet comments from women praising his charisma. A photo tagged at a bar well past business hours, Vanessa laughing at his side. Each discovery sharpened my anger, but also my focus. Charles wasn't just a man who took what he wanted. He cultivated it, manipulated it until it willingly fell into his hands. Vanessa wasn't his first conquest, and I doubted she'd be his last. But I wouldn't let him win. As I closed the browser, my resolve solidified. Charles Everly might have built an empire on charm and deceit, but no empire was untouchable. If he thought he could take what was mine without consequence, he was about to learn otherwise. My wife thought she could dismantle my life and walk away unscathed. She was wrong. The receipt, the phone call, the crimson dress, all of it had led me here. I wouldn't act impulsively. I had learned that much from last night. Instead, I planned. I would gather every shred of evidence, every detail they thought they had concealed. When I struck, it wouldn't be a single blow, it would be devastation, precise and inescapable. The storm was coming, and I wouldn't stop until I tore down everything they had built together. The weight of my suspicions demanded action, a shift from silent observation to methodical preparation. Confrontation would come, but not without irrefutable proof that would unravel every lie Vanessa had spun and every falsehood she built with him. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, her breathing steady and undisturbed, I unlocked her phone. The passcode was unchanged, a combination of our wedding anniversary and her favorite number. What I found unraveled every remaining illusion. The messages with Charles were carefully coded but unmistakable, laced with phrases like meeting rescheduled to the usual place and looking forward to the weekend. The intimacy veiled in corporate jargon was undeniable. But it wasn't the texts that broke me, it was the photos. The first was innocent enough, Vanessa at a company event, smiling alongside Charles and a group of executives. The next, however, told a different story. She stood in a luxury hotel suite, the crimson dress draped loosely off her shoulder, her expression playful. The caption read, "Couldn't wait to see you in this." My stomach churned. I scrolled further, uncovering receipts for jewelry I had never seen her wear, invoices for trips she had claimed were work retreats. Each new discovery was a dagger twisting deeper. A notification popped up in the corner of the screen, a calendar invite for dinner with C at 8 p.m. I memorized the location immediately. The next day I installed a tracking app on her phone, marketed for concerned parents or suspicious spouses. It synced seamlessly to my device, each ping a small victory in the war one was preparing to wage. Her day was as predictable as ever: morning yoga, a meeting at the office, and then an unexpected detour to a high-end boutique. By evening she was home, smiling as she cooked dinner, the picture of normalcy. But I knew better. I tracked every movement, every deviation from her usual patterns. I noted the locations she frequented with him: hidden cafes, boutique hotels, private dining rooms tucked away from prying eyes. Each pin on the map of her betrayal solidified the truth. By the week's end, the evidence was overwhelming: texts, photos, locations, receipts. Together they painted a damning picture, each piece cutting deeper than the last. I thought about the woman I had married, the promises we had exchanged, the life we had built. For years she had been my partner, my confidant, my reason to push forward. Now she was slipping away, piece by piece, into the orbit of a man who saw her as just another trophy. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just betrayal, it was the dismantling of everything I had once believed in. She wasn't just slipping away. She was already gone. One evening, while syncing her email to my laptop, I found it, an invitation to an exclusive gala hosted by Charles Everly. The event was 2 weeks away, the perfect opportunity. Public enough to ensure I wouldn't act rashly, intimate enough for me to observe them without interference. I closed the laptop, my jaw tight with resolve. This wasn't just about exposing her lies anymore. It was about reclaiming control. The storm was no longer looming, it had arrived, and I would make sure they felt its full force. The gala was a spectacle of opulence. Chandeliers glittered like frozen rain, casting cold, unforgiving light over the room. Soft jazz played in the background, barely audible over the hum of high-profile guests mingling with practiced ease. It was the world Vanessa had always yearned for, a world I thought I had given her. Dressed in a tailored tuxedo, I blended seamlessly into the crowd. No one gave a second glance to the man nursing a glass of whiskey near the edge of the room. Then I saw her. The air seemed to thicken as my gaze found her near the grand table. She was radiant in a gown that shimmered with every movement, her laughter effortless as she leaned toward Charles Everly. His hand rested on her back, possessive, as he whispered something that made her laugh, a sound that used to belong to me. They were so absorbed in their private world that they didn't notice me. Not yet. Midnight approached, and the atmosphere grew electric. Couples moved closer, champagne glasses raised in anticipation. My heart pounded as I watched them, my focus locked on the slight shift in Charles's posture, the way Vanessa turned toward him, as if drawn by an invisible force. The countdown began, the room alive with excitement. When the clock struck 12, the crowd erupted in cheers. Balloons cascaded from above, cameras flashed, and amidst the celebration it happened. She leaned in, her lips brushing his in a fleeting kiss that set my world ablaze. I waited, silent, until the cheers subsided, until the room began to settle. The storm inside me was ready, and as I moved forward, my resolve solidified. This was no longer about observation, it was time for action. My steps were measured, my anger carefully controlled, a smoldering ember instead of a consuming wildfire. They sat at the head of the table, surrounded by executives and sycophants, all hanging on Charles Everly's every word. I approached silently, unnoticed, until I broke the hum of conversation. "Happy New Year," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. Vanessa froze, her wide eyes betraying her shock as she turned to face me. Charles, ever the polished and poised figure, greeted me with a confident smile, though I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "To new beginnings," I continued, my tone calm, almost casual. Raising my glass in a mock toast, I added, "Fitting, don't you think?" Vanessa's face turned pale. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I could ask you the same," I replied, my gaze shifting deliberately to Charles, though I suppose the answer is obvious. The table had fallen silent, every pair of eyes riveted to the unfolding drama. Charles leaned back in his chair, his polished smile faltering as he studied me. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said, extending his hand. I didn't take it. Instead, I placed my phone on the table, pressing play. The recording filled the room, Vanessa's voice unmistakable, whispering promises and secrets meant only for Charles. Gasps rippled through the group as Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Charles's composure cracked. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice low and threatening. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the room. "Private? You made it public the moment you decided to humiliate me in front of a room full of people who think you're untouchable." Turning to Vanessa, I felt a pang of something, grief perhaps, or the last remnants of love. "I trusted you. I built my life around you. And this is how you repay me?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. "Don't bother," I said, my voice cold. "I've heard enough." I looked back at Charles, my expression hardened. "You think your power makes you invincible, but let me assure you it doesn't." Leaning in, I dropped my voice so only he could hear. "I know about the offshore accounts, the falsified earnings reports. By this time tomorrow, your empire will be dust." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face turned ashen, his bravado utterly shattered. Vanessa sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Straightening, I buttoned my jacket with deliberate precision. "Enjoy your evening," I said, my voice carrying the weight of finality as I walked away. The crowd parted before me, their whispers rippling in my wake. I didn't look back. The storm had broken, and I was finally free. The next morning, my plan began to unfold like a well-oiled machine. Charles Everly might have built his empire on charm and deceit, but I had the truth. And truth, wielded correctly, is the most devastating weapon of all. I started with the financial records. Weeks of surveillance and meticulous inquiries had unearthed enough evidence to expose Charles for the fraud he truly was. His offshore accounts, falsified earnings reports, and under-the-table dealings were all meticulously documented. My first call was to a trusted journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. Within hours, she had a treasure trove of incriminating files, enough to dismantle Charles's entire career. My second call was to the Securities and Exchange Commission. An anonymous tip, paired with key evidence, ensured they couldn't ignore the case. By noon, the media storm began. Headlines splashed across every outlet. Corporate scandal rocks Everly Enterprises. CEO under investigation for fraud. Stock prices plummeted, and Charles's carefully curated image of power and respectability began to crumble. While Charles scrambled to contain the fallout, I turned my focus to Vanessa and our shared assets. Armed with evidence of her infidelity and my financial contributions to our life together, my lawyers acted swiftly. The house, once a symbol of our partnership, was now mine. Our joint accounts were frozen, and Vanessa's access to the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to vanished overnight. While Charles had been busy stealing my wife, I had been busy dismantling his empire. Vanessa showed up at the house that evening, her face pale and tear-streaked. She tried to explain, to justify, but her words were hollow against the weight of her actions. "I was lonely," she said, her voice trembling. "You were always working, always chasing something bigger. I needed someone who saw me." I stared at her, my emotions a tangled knot of anger, sorrow, and pity. You had someone who saw you, I replied, my voice calm but firm. You just chose to look elsewhere. I handed her the divorce papers, already signed. Her tears flowed freely, but I felt nothing as I watched her break down. This isn't about revenge, I said, my tone resolute. It's about consequences. You made your choice, Vanessa. Now you live with it. The fallout for Charles was swift and brutal. By the time the dust settled, his empire was in ruins, and Vanessa's carefully constructed world lay in tatters. The storm I had unleashed had done its work, and as I moved forward, I left them both to face the wreckage of their choices. By the end of the week, Charles Everly's empire lay in ruins. Forced to resign as CEO, his name became synonymous with scandal, the celebrated titan of industry reduced to a pariah. What had once been an empire of influence and power was now rubble, and with it went Vanessa's relationship with him, a fleeting affair, glittering with stolen moments and forbidden allure. As swiftly as she had clung to him, she left, her so-called love evaporating the moment his power did. With the divorce finalized and my name cleared of any financial entanglements, I began the process of rebuilding. Not the life I once had, but something entirely new, something stronger. The house, once a monument to shared dreams, was stripped of its memories and transformed into a sanctuary of solitude and reflection. The emptiness, once oppressive, became freeing, a blank slate upon which I could redefine myself. From a distance, I watched Vanessa's carefully curated world unravel. She moved into a modest apartment, a far cry from the life of luxury she had once known. The last I heard, she had taken a job far beneath her qualifications, her charm no longer enough to sustain her. Meanwhile, I found peace not in vengeance, but in the justice of reclaiming my story. One crisp evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, the faint sound of jazz drifted from a nearby cafe. The clear sky stretched endlessly above, and for the first time in years I felt light. The storm had passed, and in its wake I had rediscovered myself. The following year became a journey of self-reclamation. At first, the silence of the house was deafening. Each room whispered reminders of what had been lost and what had been taken. But as weeks turned into months, that emptiness transformed into a canvas for new beginnings. I threw myself into my work, not as a distraction, but as a means of rediscovering purpose. The corporate ladder I once climbed for shared dreams now became a monument to my resilience. Promotions followed, each one validating the man I had become, focused, determined, and unapologetically independent. Gone was the man who measured his worth by shared milestones and fleeting affirmations. In his place stood someone stronger, someone who saw losing Vanessa not as a loss, but as liberation. I took up hobbies long neglected: photography, hiking, cooking. All things that had once seemed mundane now held a sense of discovery. Life became less about filling a void and more about embracing it as an opportunity to grow. The gym became a sanctuary, each mile on the treadmill, each weight lifted, mirroring the emotional burden I was shedding. I wasn't simply rebuilding, I was transforming, leaving behind the man who once tied his worth to another's approval. Months after the divorce was finalized, Vanessa reached out. It was a rainy evening when her name lit up my phone. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity, or perhaps the need for closure, compelled me to answer. Her voice was hesitant, tinged with vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. "I made a mistake," she began, her words tumbling out as apologies and excuses. She spoke of regret, of longing, of the life we had built and how she wanted to make amends. "I've changed," she said. "Can we meet? Just to talk." I let her words hang in the air, their weight failing to reach me. "Finally," I replied, my tone steady and devoid of anger. "I wish you well, Vanessa," I said, "but there's no place for you in the life I'm building now." The silence on the other end was heavy, but I didn't waver. When I ended the call, it felt like closing a door on a chapter that no longer served me. The next New Year's Eve arrived, marking the completion of a full circle. This time, the venue was different, a cozy rooftop bar overlooking the city. The crowd was smaller, the atmosphere intimate. The clink of champagne glasses and soft laughter filled the air, but it was no longer a backdrop to pain. Beside me stood Emily, a colleague turned friend, whose warmth and humor had slowly drawn me out of my isolation. She wasn't a replacement for what I had lost. She was a reminder of what I deserved. As the clock struck midnight, we raised our glasses in a quiet toast. There were no grand declarations, no stolen glances, just a moment of genuine connection. Fireworks lit up the sky, their vibrant colors reflecting in her eyes as she smiled. For the first time in years, I felt an unshakable sense of peace. Losing Vanessa wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life I had always deserved, a life built on authenticity, strength, and hope.